There are doors that close with a bang, doors that slam so hard the walls shake and the pictures rattle on their nails. Those doors can be opened again. The force that shut them leaves a wound in the wood, a gap in the frame, a space through which an apology might one day slip. But the door of Hadley Caddell's farmhouse closed with a small click of an iron latch sliding into its cradle, and that sound so quiet it could have been mistaken for a bird landing on the roof, followed Darcy Caddell for 60 years. It was the last morning of October 1903. Frost had come early to the Ozarks that year, and it lay across the fields lay a white sheet pulled over the face of the dying. Darcy stood on the porch with the cold already biting through the thin wool of her coat. She was 16 years old. Behind her through the door she was no longer permitted to enter. Her father was already turning back toward the kitchen, his boots heavy on the pine floor, each step a nail driven into the coffin of her childhood. What had she done? She had sold 2 of his sheep, 2 sick ewes he had marked for death because they were, in his words, not worth the hay. Darcy had taken them down to the Erickson farm at the bottom of the valley and sold them for a pittance. And with the money she had bought veterinary salts for the draft horse, a big chestnut mare who had been coughing blood for a week, and whom Hadley had also decided was not worth saving. She had made a decision about his property without asking his permission. She had acted on her own judgment, and her judgment had been better than his, and that was the one thing Hadley Caddell could not forgive. He had not shouted. He had not raised his hand. He had stood in the kitchen with his arms at his sides and his jaw set in a line as straight and final as a horizon, and he had said in the flat cadence of a man reading a bill of sale, "You have a will that is not proper for a daughter. You are not my child." Then he had handed her a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a gesture of charity so meager it was itself a form of cruelty. Then the door, the latch, the click. But Darcy had seen something in the instant before it closed. His hand on the iron latch had paused. 2 seconds, perhaps less. His knuckles had gone white against the dark metal, the tendons standing out like wire beneath the weathered skin. He had hesitated. He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway, and that was worse, far worse than if he had not hesitated at all. A man who doesn't know he's cruel can be forgiven his ignorance. A man who knows and chooses the cruelty regardless has made a deliberate transaction with his own conscience, and the price is paid by someone else. Inside the kitchen, Darcy's Aunt Jocelyn stood by the stove. Jocelyn was Hadley's younger sister, a small woman with quick hands and a voice she had learned to keep quiet in her brother's house. She had opened her mouth to speak when Hadley pronounced his verdict, and Hadley had turned to her with a look that needed no words. "You say one thing, Jocelyn, and you walk out the same door." Jocelyn had closed her mouth. She had looked down at the flour on her hands. She had said nothing. But as Darcy turned and walked down the porch steps, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the gray line of the mountain to the west, Jocelyn did something that would alter the course of a life, though neither of them knew it yet. She stepped to the door, opened it a crack, and slipped her hand into the pocket of Darcy's coat as it passed. Into that pocket she pressed a small folding knife and 4 silver coins wrapped in a handkerchief embroidered with daisies. It was the handkerchief of Darcy's mother, who had died 7 years before, and whose absence had turned Hadley from a difficult man into a cold one. Jocelyn closed the door again. The whole thing took 3 seconds. Darcy did not feel it happen. She would not discover the gifts until that night in the dark when everything had changed. She walked. The loaf of bread sat dense and heavy in the crook of her arm, and in her right hand she held the only thing that was truly hers, a small, smooth river stone polished to a dull shine by the thumb of her grandmother Linnea, who had died 3 years before Darcy was expelled from the world of the living. Grandma Linnea had been the one who taught Darcy to read the land. Not books, not letters, but the language of root and wind and water that ran beneath the surface of things like a second secret alphabet. Everything has a hidden warmth, child, she used to say, her voice like the rustle of dry corn husks. You just have to be patient enough to find it. She had taught Darcy which roots were safe to eat and which would twist the stomach into knots. She had taught her how to read the angle of the wind and know whether rain was coming or snow. She had taught her how to press an ear to the ground and hear if the earth was willing the faint murmur of water running beneath the surface, finding its way through stone in the dark. And she had told Darcy one more thing. Once, only once, sitting by the fire on a winter night while Hadley was out in the barn and the house was quiet enough to speak freely, Linnea had said, "When I was young, I got lost on that mountain, the big one to the west. I was up there 2 days, and I found a place where the rock breathed warm air, like the earth itself was alive and exhaling. I never found it again. But the mountain keeps its secrets, Darcy, and the mountain keeps the people who know how to listen." Darcy had been 10 years old. She had thought it was a fairy tale. Now, walking away from the only home she had known, she was not sure. The stone in her hand was cold. The bread under her arm was not enough to last 3 days. The mountain sat on the western horizon like a sleeping beast, dark against the pale October sky, and it was the only thing in her field of vision that did not feel like a door closing. But she did not go to the mountain. Not yet. She went to town first because she was 16 and still believed that the world of people might have a place for her if she could only find the right door to knock on. The town of Harlan Creek was a day's walk east, a cluster of frame buildings, around a general store and a church, and Darcy arrived at dusk with her feet blistered and the bread already half gone. She went to the general store because the general store was the center of everything, the place where news was exchanged and credit was extended, and the social machinery of the valley was oiled with gossip and commerce. The store belonged to Cora Jessup. She was a widow in her 50s, a woman whose husband had left her with a building, a ledger full of debts owed to her, and a disposition that had been practical before his death and had become something harder afterward. She ran the store with the efficiency of a machine and the warmth of a January wind. She knew every family in the valley, what they owed, what they were worth, and what they could be trusted for. Darcy stood at the counter. She had rehearsed what she would say on the walk down. She would offer to work. She would sweep stock, shelves, haul deliveries. She would sleep in the storeroom. She would eat whatever was left over. She was strong and she was willing, and she would not cause trouble. She got as far as her name. "Caddell," Cora said, and the word landed on the counter between them like a dead fish. "Hadley Caddell's girl." "Yes, ma'am." Cora's eyes narrowed. Not with malice exactly, but with the cold arithmetic of a woman who calculated human worth in dollars and cents. "Your father owes me 3 months for feed and dry goods. 3 months and not a penny paid. You carry that name, you carry that debt." Then she raised her voice, not shouting, but projecting with the practiced volume of a woman accustomed to being heard across a crowded room. "Anyone gives this girl a bed, you're taking on the Caddell account. Fair warning." The store had 4 other people in it: a farmer examining axe handles, a woman with a child on her hip, an old man by the stove. None of them looked at Darcy. They looked at the floor, at the walls, at the merchandise, at anything that was not the 16-year-old girl standing at the counter with breadcrumbs on her coat and the dust of a day's walk on her shoes. Darcy left. She did not cry. She did not argue. She understood what had happened with a clarity that was almost physical, like a bone setting after a break. She had not been rejected by Cora Jessup. She had been rejected by her father's shadow. Hadley Caddell's debts in Hadley Caddell's name had preceded her into every house and every store in the valley, and they would follow her into any room she entered for as long as she stayed in the world of the valley floor. She was not just a girl without a home. She was a girl wearing a name that was itself a locked door. There was only one direction left: west, toward the mountain, the great dark mass that sealed the edge of the valley like a wall between the known world and whatever lay beyond it. It was a place of granite and myth, a place people did not go. The old lead mines had been abandoned for decades. The slopes were steep, the forest thick, and the stories that came down from the mountain were stories of collapsed tunnels and bad air, and the bones of men who had gone in looking for silver and never come out. But Darcy looked at the mountain and saw something none of them saw. She saw the only place on earth that did not know her father's name. She walked west. She did not look back. To look back would be to give Hadley the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate, and the people of Harlan Creek the confirmation that she was already lost. The first week on the mountain taught Darcy the cartography of hunger. The bread was gone by the third day. She ate roots that Grandma Linnea had taught her to identify the knobby tubers of wild ginger, the starchy hearts of cattails from the creek beds. She brewed tea from pine bark that was so bitter it made her jaw ache. But it was hot, and it was something to put in her stomach when there was nothing else. She set snares for rabbits using thread pulled from the hem of her own coat, the small folding knife she still did not know she possessed sitting undiscovered in her pocket. On the fourth night, sitting beneath a rock overhang with a small fire guttering against the wind, Darcy reached into her coat pocket looking for crumbs. Her fingers found metal. She pulled out the knife, the coins, the handkerchief. She held them in the firelight and recognized the embroidery instantly. Daisies, her mother's handkerchief. She brought it to her face and smelled lavender soap, cheap and faint, and beneath it the smell of jocelyn, of flour and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a woman who had spent her life tending other people's kitchens. Jocelyn had acted. In that kitchen, with Hadley's threat hanging in the air like a blade, Jocelyn had made a choice. It was a small choice. It was a terrified, fumbling, inadequate choice. But it was a choice, and it was the only one anyone had made on Darcy's behalf. And Darcy wept. For the first time since the latch had clicked, she cried. Not out of self-pity or despair, but out of a relief so sudden and so deep it felt like a cramp releasing in her chest. Someone had cared. Someone had acted. The knife was real. The coins were real. The daisies on the handkerchief were stitched by a hand that had been dust for 7 years. But the love in them was not dust. It was alive, and it was in her pocket, and it had been there all along. The knife became her most important tool. She used it to sharpen snare stakes, to split kindling, to cut strips of bark. The coins she saved. They were not enough to buy anything meaningful, but they were a bridge, a possibility, a thread connecting her to the world she had been expelled from. A week after her exile, with the last scraps of root and bark tea churning in her empty stomach, Darcy was following a game trail high on the mountain's western flank when the weather turned. It did not turn slowly. A wall of snow came over the ridge like a gray curtain being drawn across a stage, and within minutes the air was white and the temperature had dropped so sharply that the moisture in her nostrils froze with each breath. She ran along the rock face, one hand on the stone, looking for any depression, any overhang, any crack in the mountain's armor where she could shelter from the killing wind. The rock was sheer and smooth and offered nothing. Her fingers were going numb. The snow was horizontal, driving into her face with the force of thrown sand. Then the ivy. A curtain of ancient ivy glazed with ice hanging over a section of rock that looked no different from any other. But behind the ivy there was a gap, a dark mouth in the stone barely tall enough for a person to stand upright, and from it came something impossible: warmth. A slow, steady exhalation of humid air that smelled of minerals and deep earth, a breath so incongruous against the razor wind that Darcy thought for a moment she was hallucinating. Fear fought with desperation. The valley stories played in her mind, spirits in the mountain collapse galleries air that killed without warning. But the cold was a more immediate demon, and its teeth were already in her skin. She clutched the river stone in one hand and the knife in the other, pushed the ivy aside and stepped through. Darkness, total and absolute, like being swallowed. But the warmth was real. It wrapped around her like a blanket pulled from a bed where someone had been sleeping. A warmth that was not the dry heat of a fire, but something deeper, something that seemed to rise from the bones of the earth itself. She stood still, breathing, letting the warmth seep into her frozen hands and face, and she felt the air moving around her. Not stagnant, not dead, alive, circulating in a slow, rhythmic pattern like the breathing of an enormous animal asleep in the dark. As her eyes adjusted, shapes emerged from the blackness. Rails, iron rails red with rust disappearing into the depths. Timber supports gray with dust stacked against the walls. The remnants of human labor, human ambition, human failure. This was not a cave, it was a mine. An old lead mine of the Ozarks abandoned a generation ago when the veins ran dry and the money moved on. A scar in the mountain forgotten by everyone. For Darcy, it was a miracle. She went deeper over the following days using candle stubs she found in a collapsed foreman's shack near the entrance. The main tunnel ran straight for about 100 feet before branching into a network of smaller galleries. In one large chamber, the warmth was pronounced. Water dripped from the ceiling, warm to the touch, collecting in a natural stone basin and creating a small pool that steamed perpetually in the cool air. This was the heart. The explanation was simple, though Darcy would not learn the scientific name for it until decades later. Deep beneath the mountain, the Earth's own heat warmed the groundwater, which rose through natural fractures in the rock. Cool air entered the mine through the lower entrance, was warmed by contact with the heated stone, rose naturally through the tunnels, and exited through cracks in fissures higher on the mountain. The result was a constant, self-sustaining circulation. The temperature inside held steady year-round at roughly 50 degrees. Too cool for comfort in summer, but in winter, when the outside world froze solid and animals died in the fields, 50 degrees was the difference between life and death. Darcy did not know any of this in scientific terms. She knew only what her grandmother had told her: the mountain had a hidden warmth. And standing in that steaming chamber, with the candle flame steady in the still air and the cold of the world locked outside, she understood that Grandma Linnea had not been telling fairy tales. She had been telling the truth. She had been here or near here 50 years ago, lost on the mountain as a young woman, and she had found this same impossible warmth and carried the memory of it for the rest of her life. But there was something else in the chamber. On the wall near the pool at shoulder height, Darcy's candlelight fell across marks in the stone. Not the marks of miners, not the rough scratches of pickaxes and drill bits. Letters, carved carefully into the rock with a tool that had been held by a steady hand. Though the years had softened their edges, she held the candle close and read. November 1847. D.L. God forgive them. And below in the same hand, the mountain keeps me when no one else will. Darcy touched the letters with her fingertips, felt the depth of each stroke beneath her skin. Someone had been here before her. Someone had been cast out, had found this warmth, had carved their testimony into stone, and left it for the darkness to keep. 56 years ago, a person known only as DL had stood in this same spot, breathing this same warm air, and had been alone enough to talk to the rock. Had DL survived, there were no bones, no belongings, no further marks anywhere Darcy could find. Only these two lines, a cry and a declaration hanging on the wall like a painting in an empty museum. The question settled into Darcy's chest and stayed there. Did DL walk out of this mountain, or did this mountain become DL's grave? Darcy made a decision standing before those carved words. She would not become a line on a wall. She would not be a mystery for the next lost soul to puzzle over. She would live, and she would do more than live. That first night, she slept just inside the entrance on a bed of pine boughs she had dragged in from outside, listening to the storm howl beyond the ivy curtain. Inside, the wind was only a distant moan. The temperature held steady. The mountain breathed, and she was in its lung. Weeks passed. Darcy learned the mountain's rhythms, its moods, its generosities, and its refusals. She learned where the game trails ran and where the rabbits sheltered. She learned which slopes caught enough winter sun to grow the tough, dry grass she could harvest for bedding. She became a creature of observation, as silent and watchful as the owls that hunted the ridgelines at dusk. Then on a rare afternoon when the snow paused and the clouds thinned enough to let a weak sun through, she ventured lower on the slope than usual, drawn by a faint sound. Desperate, thin, an animal in distress, she found it tangled in a thicket of thorns, a lamb no more than a few months old, its wool matted with ice, and its body shaking so violently that the thorn rattled around it. A straggler from a valley flock, lost motherless and doomed. In its terrified eyes, Darcy saw a reflection so precise it stopped her breath. A small, helpless thing thrown into the cold by forces it could not understand, waiting to die. She spent an hour freeing it from the thorns, working with the knife and her bare fingers until both were bleeding. The lamb was too weak and too cold to walk. Without a second thought, she hoisted it onto her shoulders and began the climb back to the mine. It was dead weight, fragile and heavy at once, and the slope was steep, and the snow was deep, and twice she fell to her knees and had to push herself up again with the lamb sliding on her back. But in her chest there burned a fierce protective purpose that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with something older and deeper. This creature was hers to save, not because she owned it, but because she had found it, and finding it had made her responsible, and responsibility was the first thing that felt like home since the latch had clicked. She carried the lamb past the cold entrance tunnel and into the geothermal chamber, laying it on a bed of dry moss near the steaming pool. For hours she sat with it, rubbing its frozen limbs with slow, patient hands, dripping warm water into its mouth from a leaf folded into a funnel. Gradually the shaking stopped. The lamb's breathing steadied, and then in the vast warm darkness of the chamber, a sound, a single weak bleat, the first voice of another living creature in Darcy's underground world. She named the lamb Stone. "Because you're stubborn as the rock in my pocket," she told it, and the sound of her own voice startled her. She had not spoken aloud in weeks. Stone thrived. His wool grew thick and healthy in the stable warmth. He drank the mineral-rich water and ate the dried grass Darcy harvested from the sunny slopes. He followed her through the tunnels like a stone, his small hooves clicking on the stone floor, his soft bleating filling the spaces that silence had owned. And watching him grow, watching his ribs disappear beneath healthy flesh and his eyes brighten from dull terror to curious intelligence, Darcy knew her idea was not madness. Life could flourish here, sheltered from the tyranny of the sky. This was not just a refuge, it could be a farm. But a farm required things she did not have: breeding stock, feed, supplies, things that could only be acquired from the world of people, the world that had shut its doors. To build what she was beginning to imagine, Darcy would have to go back to Harlan Creek, back to Cora Jessup and the shadow of her father's name. She was planning for that confrontation when a more immediate threat arrived. 2 months after Darcy had settled into the mine, she went out to check her snare line and found every trap empty, not sprung and emptied by animals. Cut. The cord sliced clean with a blade, the stakes pulled and tossed aside. Human work. She knew his reputation before she knew his name. Niles Prescott. He was a trapper and hunter in his mid-40s who had lived on the mountain for years, moving between seasonal camps, claiming the entire western slope as his personal territory. Not a cruel man by intention, not a violent one by habit, but a territorial one, the way a wolf is territorial by instinct, by necessity, by the simple conviction that the resources of the mountain belonged to whoever had been there longest, and Niles Prescott had been there longest. She found him on the trail 2 days later. Or rather, he allowed her to find him. He was sitting on a boulder beside the path, a big man in a coat made of hides. He had tanned himself with a face like a cliff that had been weathered by decades of wind and a pair of eyes that missed nothing. He looked at her the way he might look at a fox that had wandered into his trap line, with interest but without warmth. "Mountain's got no room for two," he said. His voice was low and flat. "I've been here longer. You want a trap, go down to the valley." Darcy did not argue. She was not strong enough, not established enough, not sure enough of her position to confront a man who had lived on this mountain since before she was born. She turned and went back up the slope, but she did not leave. She set new traps in different locations, farther from his lines, in places that required longer walks and harder climbs. Niles found them and cut them too. A silent war began on the mountainside, fought in severed cord and relocated stakes, a war in which neither combatant spoke and neither yielded. Then Niles tracked her to the mine. She came back from gathering firewood one afternoon and saw him standing at the entrance, one hand pulling aside the frozen ivy, his face tilted up to catch the warm air flowing out. The expression on his face was not wonder. It was calculation. She could see him thinking this was a perfect place to smoke and cure game meat through the winter, warm enclosed, ventilated, everything a hunter needed. "I need this cave, girl," he said without turning around. "You find somewhere else." Darcy set down the firewood. She walked to the entrance and stood directly in his path. In her right hand she held the folding knife Jocelyn had given her. Not raised, not threatening, simply present. She was aware of how small she was compared to him. She was aware that the knife was laughable as a weapon. But she had spent weeks building something inside this mountain, and the thing she had built was more than a shelter. It was the first thing in her life that was entirely hers, made by her hands and sustained by her will, and she would not give it up to anyone. Not to Hadley, not to Cora, and not to Niles Prescott. "Go inside," she said. Her voice was steady. "See what I've built, then decide if you want to destroy it." Niles looked at her. He was not accustomed to being challenged, and certainly not by a girl half his age and a third his weight. But something in her eyes gave him pause. Not fear, not bravado. Something quieter and more dangerous, the absolute certainty of a person who has nothing left to lose and everything to defend. He stepped past her and into the mine. He was inside for a long time. When he came out, his face had changed. He had seen the sturdy pen built from old mine timbers, mortised and pegged with a precision that spoke of patience rather than skill. He had seen Stone the lamb lying calmly on clean bedding, chewing dried grass. He had seen the system of pipes carrying warm water from the geothermal pool to a hand-carved trough. He had seen the candles arranged on ledges, the dried herbs hanging from pegs, a small sleeping area with its pine bough mattress and its folded blanket of rabbit skins stitched together with painstaking care. He had seen the carved words of DL on the wall, and he had seen that someone had placed a small bundle of wildflowers beneath them, the stems dry and brittle now, but placed with reverence. He said nothing. He looked at Darcy once more, and whatever he saw in her face completed the argument her words had begun. He turned and walked into the forest and did not come back. From that day he stopped cutting her snares. The silent war was over. But Darcy knew it was not finished. Niles Prescott knew about the mine. He knew about the warmth, the water, the impossible shelter inside the mountain. He could tell anyone. The secret of Darcy's world now rested in the hands of a man she did not trust and could not control. What she did not understand not yet was why he had walked away, why he had looked at what she built and chosen to leave it standing. The answer was connected to those two initials on the chamber wall, connected to a history Niles carried in his blood, and in the scar on his neck that Darcy had not yet been close enough to see. But that answer was waiting in the dark like everything else of value in this mountain. It would come when the time was right and not before. For now, Darcy stood at the entrance to her mind, the knife still in her hand, the warm air at her back, and she looked out at the cold world that had expelled her. She had a shelter. She had stone. She had an idea that was growing inside her, the way the warmth grew inside the mountain, from a deep source she could feel but not yet name. To make that idea real, she would need to go back down into the valley. She would need to face Cora Jessup again, this time not as a girl asking for shelter, but as a woman with something to sell. She would need to find the hidden warmth inside the coldest person in Heartland Creek, and she would need to do it without flinching, without begging, and without ever again speaking the name Caddell as though it were an apology. The mountain breathed at her back. The winter pressed against her face. Between the two, Darcy Caddell stood in the only doorway that had ever been hers, and she began to plan. Spring arrived on the mountain not with birdsong or blossoms, but with mud. The snow retreated uphill in grudging stages, leaving behind a slope of exposed rock and red clay that sucked at Darcy's boots with every step. She had survived her first winter inside the mountain, on roots bark tea, the occasional rabbit, and a stubbornness that ran deeper than hunger. Now, with the trails passable again, she turned her attention to the idea that had been growing in her mind through the long, dark months. The mine would become a farm. But a farm needed materials she could not pull from stone. She needed breeding stock, rope grain salt. She needed the valley, and the valley needed a reason to open its doors to a girl it had shut out. Darcy spent the first weeks of thaw harvesting. She climbed to elevations where the Ozark ginseng grew wild among the leaf litter, the knotted roots that valley farmers ignored, but traveling medicine men paid good money for. She dug them carefully the way Grandma Linnea had shown her, taking only the largest plants and leaving the young ones to grow. She washed the roots in snowmelt, dried them slowly on flat stones near the mine entrance, where the warm air from inside met the cool breeze from outside, and when she had a bundle the size of 2 fists, she wrapped them in bark and began the long walk down to Heartland Creek. She did not go to the front door of Cora Jessup's store. She went to the side entrance, the one the suppliers used, and she set the bundle of ginseng on the counter without ceremony or greeting. "Ozark ginseng," she said. "Clean roots dried properly. You buy it or I walk to the next town." Cora looked at the ginseng. She picked up a root and turned it in her fingers, held it to her nose, broke off a small piece, and tasted it. Her expression did not change, But Darcy saw something shift behind her eyes, a recalculation, the numbers in Cora's head rearranging themselves around a new fact. This was not a charity case standing before her. This was a supplier. Cora named a price. It was fair. Darcy accepted it without haggling because haggling would have suggested she was uncertain of the value and she was not. She bought rope salt and a small sack of grain with the money, and she turned to leave. Girl, Cora said. Darcy stopped but did not turn around. I don't know where you're living up on that mountain, but if you die of cold, I lose the only ginseng source in 40 miles. So don't die. It was not kindness. It was commerce. But it was the first thread connecting Darcy back to the human world, and she carried it up the mountain with her, alongside the rope and salt, feeling its weight in a different way. Over the following months, Darcy returned to Cora's store with bundles of medicinal roots, jars of wild berry preserves sealed with beeswax, and small pouches of dried herbs that the medicine men coveted. Each time she came, the transaction was clean and wordless. Cora paid fair prices. Darcy bought what she needed. Neither of them mentioned the day Cora had announced her father's debts to a room full of strangers. That day existed between them like a stone in a riverbed, always present, never discussed, shaping the current without being seen. With money accumulating slowly, Darcy began to build. The mine timbers abandoned for a generation were dense and hard, cured by decades of dry underground air. She dragged them to the main chamber one at a time, her shoulders aching, her hands blistered and bleeding. Using the rusted head of a mining axe she had found in the debris and sharpened on a flat stone over the course of 3 patient days, she notched the timbers and fitted them together, building a proper pen for Stone and for the animal she intended to bring. The water system came next. She discovered a pile of discarded drilling pipes in a side tunnel, narrow iron tubes left behind when the mining company pulled out. She scraped them clean of rust and sedite, then laid them in a gentle downhill grade from the main pool to a series of troughs she carved from softer stone using a miner's pick. Gravity did the work. A steady, quiet flow of warm water now ran through her growing stable, and the animals she would bring would never go thirsty and their water would never freeze. She bought her first breeding ewes from a farmer named Erickson, the same man who had bought her father's 6 sheep a year before. He sold her 2 females at a price that was low because his own flock was struggling and he needed the cash. He did not ask where she was keeping them. She did not volunteer the information. She led them up the mountain on foot, a full day's climb, and brought them into the warm dark of the mine, and they stood blinking in the candlelight, with their nostrils flaring at the strange underground scents, and within an hour they had settled beside Stone and begun to eat. The following summer, Darcy worked without rest. She scythed wild grass on the high meadows, bound it into bundles, and hauled it to the tunnel she had designated as her hay store. The dry, cool air there preserved the hay perfectly, keeping it green and fragrant, while surface barns lost half their stores to mold and rot. She stacked the bundles floor to ceiling, and the sweet smell of cured grass mixed with the mineral scent of the mine and became the smell of home. The chickens came in autumn, 6 hens and a rooster bought with wool money from the first shearing of her small flock. She built their coop against the warmest section of rock wall, where the stone itself radiated a steady, gentle heat. The hens took to it, immediately settling onto their roosts with the contented clucking of birds that had found paradise. Their eggs were the first food Darcy produced inside the mountain, and the morning she cracked the first one into a tin cup and saw the bright orange yolk, she sat on the floor of the chamber and ate it with a sense of triumph that no one else in the world could have understood. Then came the catastrophe that taught her the mountain could take as easily as it gave. She had expanded the chicken coop into a side tunnel to give the growing flock more room. The tunnel seemed identical to the others she was using, dry stable with good rock overhead. She moved 6 birds in on a Monday. By Thursday morning, 4 of them were dead. She found them lying on the stone floor in postures that looked almost peaceful, as if they had simply decided to stop. No wounds, no sign of predators, no struggle. The other 2 were alive but barely staggering on their roosts with half-closed eyes, their movements slow and confused. Darcy grabbed them and carried them out to the main chamber, and within an hour in the open air, they had recovered, blinking and clucking as though nothing had happened. She went back to the side tunnel alone. She held her candle up and watched the flame. In every other tunnel, she used the candle flame leaned and flickered with the constant movement of air. Here the flame stood straight and still. No air movement, no circulation. A dead pocket where invisible gas accumulated in the stillness, pooling along the floor where the chickens roosted, filling their lungs with something that was not oxygen while they slept. The mountain had shown her its other face. The same geology that provided warmth and flowing air also created sealed chambers where death collected silently. Darcy sat in the main tunnel after sealing the poisoned gallery with stones, and for the first time since arriving at the mine, she felt the full weight of her isolation settle on her like a physical burden. The 4 dead chickens were not just a loss of livestock, they were a message. If she made the wrong choice in the wrong tunnel, if she misjudged the air or the rock or the temperature, there was no one to find her, no one to help, no one who would know she was gone until the warm air from the ventilation shaft stopped carrying the faint sounds of life and carried only silence. That night, sitting alone with stone pressed against her legs, Darcy spoke to the darkness. "If I die here," she said, "nobody finds me. I become those letters on the wall. DL and then DC and then some other girl's initials, and the mountain collects us all like stones in a pocket." Stone shifted against her legs and bleated softly, and the sound of his voice pulled her back from the edge of something she did not want to name. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at the candle flame leaning in the draft of the main tunnel, the good air flowing past her, the system she had learned to trust. "But I am not dead," she said aloud, "and tomorrow I will check the east tunnel." From that day forward, before entering any new section of the mine, she held a candle into the opening and watched. If the flame died or went still, she sealed the tunnel and moved on. She never lost another animal to bad air. The lesson had been written in the bodies of 4 chickens, and she had read it, and she would not need to read it again. After a year of selling wool from her growing flock, Darcy saved enough to make the purchase that would transform everything. A draft horse. Not a riding horse, but a heavy Belgian mare, bred for work, quiet in temperament, and pregnant. She was the most expensive thing Darcy had ever bought, and leading her up the mountain trail was the most terrifying journey she had made since the night she first entered the mine. The mare was enormous, patient, and cooperative, but the trail was narrow and steep, and twice Darcy had to coax her past sections of loose shale where one wrong step would have sent them both tumbling down the slope. They reached the mine at dusk. Darcy led the mare through the entrance, past the ivy curtain, and into the warm tunnel. The horse stopped. Her ears swiveled forward. Her nostrils widened, drawing in the strange air, the mineral warmth, the scent of sheep and hay and heated stone. Then she lowered her head and walked forward of her own accord, her heavy hooves ringing on the rock floor. And Darcy felt something expand in her chest that was larger than relief and deeper than satisfaction. The mare had accepted the mountain. The mountain had accepted the mare. Months later, in the dead of winter, the Belgian foaled in the underground stable. A dark colt, healthy and strong, his first breath drawn in air that had been warmed by the earth's own heat. He was the first animal born inside the mountain, and his arrival felt to Darcy like a covenant life would continue here. It would not merely survive, it would be born. It was around this time that Darcy made her peace with Niles Prescott, though peace was perhaps too strong a word for what passed between them. She needed good oak timber to build ventilation frames for the tunnels she was opening, and the best oak grew in the high forest that Niles considered his domain. Rather than take it by stealth, she went openly. She carried with her a round of sheep's milk cheese she had pressed herself, and a bundle of the jointwort herb that eased the ache she had noticed in his gait during their earlier confrontations. She did not seek him out. She placed the cheese and herbs on the flat boulder where she had first found him sitting, and she walked away. 2 days later, she returned. The gifts were gone. In their place was a stack of freshly cut oak, split and debarked, stacked with the care of a man who knew wood. No words were exchanged. No agreement was signed. But from that day, the dynamic between them shifted. Niles stopped treating the mountain as territory to be defended and began treating it as a space with room for two. Occasionally, Darcy found game meat hanging from a branch near the mine entrance, a haunch of venison or a brace of rabbits left without attribution or expectation. Niles never entered the mine again. He never acknowledged the cheese or the herbs. But the war was over, settled not by force but by the oldest currency on the mountain, the exchange of what one person had for what another person needed. Darcy was 18 years old and had been living in the mine for 2 years when Ronan arrived. He came in October with the leaves turning and the air sharpening toward winter. He was a surveyor contracted by a railroad company to map the abandoned mining concessions of the Ozarks, a routine assessment to determine whether the old lead veins were worth reopening. He was a man of straight lines and precise angles of compasses and plumb bobs, a man whose entire understanding of the world was built on the premise that nature could be measured and the measurements could be trusted. His instruments told him there should be a spring near the western face of the mountain. Instead, they detected an anomaly, a column of warm, humid air rising from the slope where only cold should have been. He followed the anomaly the way he followed every deviation from his maps, with professional curiosity and a pencil in his hand, and he found himself standing before a gap in the rock, partially covered by dead ivy, with warm air flowing over his face and the faint, impossible sound of animals somewhere inside. He called out, "Is anyone in there?" Darcy appeared in the entrance holding a lantern. She did not speak. She studied him with the same careful attention she gave to a new tunnel, looking for signs of danger, testing the air. Ronan saw a young woman with calloused hands and steady eyes standing in the mouth of a mountain as though she had grown there. He set down his surveying tripod, a gesture of openness. "No bad intentions," he said. "My name is Ronan Stowe. I'm a cartographer. The mountain is breathing and I've never seen anything like it." Darcy weighed his words. He had not spoken of ghosts or outlaws. He had spoken of the mountain. She stepped aside. What Ronan saw inside dissolved his understanding of what was possible. The orderly pens, the healthy sheep with their thick fleeces, the chickens roosting on a timber beam, the great Belgian mare watching him with intelligent eyes, the foal beside her. The network of pipes, the carved troughs with their steady flow of warm water, the stacked hay, the organized tools. The air was clean, warm, alive with the breath of animals and the soft percussion of water falling into stone. It smelled of pine shavings and warm earth and healthy livestock. Not the rank stench of a closed stable, but the scent of a system in balance. He did not ask her why she was living inside a mountain. He asked how she had balanced the ventilation. And in that question, Darcy heard for the first time the language of someone who understood what she had built not as the eccentric shelter of a hermit, but as engineering, as a solution. The air moves on its own, she told him, her voice low and unpracticed in conversation. It comes in cold through the lower entrance, warms on the stone, rises. The upper tunnels push it out. Ronan stared at her. You've built a lung, he said quietly. They spent the following days in a collaboration that was not yet friendship and not yet anything more, but was something neither of them had experienced before the meeting of two minds that operated in different languages, but were solving the same equation. Ronan brought system and theory, Darcy brought instinct in years of observation. He drew maps of the tunnel network marking air currents and temperatures with the precision of a man trained to record the world in ink. She showed him which tunnels were safe and which she had sealed where the water ran warmest, where the hay kept best. But they did not agree on everything. Ronan wanted to plan expansions systematically, calculating load-bearing capacity and optimal ventilation before moving a single stone. Darcy worked by feel, opening new galleries when she sensed they were needed, trusting the mountain to tell her where to go. The tension between their methods surfaced on the third day when Ronan drew a detailed schematic for expanding the horse stable, and Darcy ignored it completely, instead carving a new water trough in a location he had not approved. You'll collapse the ceiling if you keep carving without measuring, Ronan said, his voice controlled but tight. I've been carving in this rock for 2 years without a map, Darcy replied, and you lost 4 chickens to bad air. The words hung between them. Darcy looked at the floor. He was right. Her instinct had saved her many times, but it had also failed her, and the failure had cost lives. That evening, after feeding the animals, she sat beside Ronan's lantern and looked at his maps for the first time with genuine attention. She saw her own mind drawn in clean lines, the tunnels she had explored, and the ones she had sealed, the air currents marked with arrows, the temperatures noted at each junction. She saw her world through the eyes of a man who understood its structure, and for the first time she realized that what she had built could be not just maintained but improved. It was not a romantic moment. It was something more durable than that. It was the moment Darcy stopped being a survivor working alone and became a builder working with a partner. One evening, near the end of Ronan's week, sitting by the thermal pool with the steam rising around them, Ronan said something that surprised her. You should write down what you know. Keep records. If anything happens to you, everything you've learned dies with you. Darcy's reaction was sharper than he expected. I don't need to write anything down. I don't need anyone to remember me. The force of it startled them both. Ronan looked at her, and understanding passed between them without explanation. She was afraid, not of being forgotten, but of becoming what DL had become, a set of initials on a wall. To write things down was to admit she might vanish. To keep records was to prepare for her own absence, and she was not ready to concede that the mountain might one day hold her story instead of her life. Ronan did not press her, but that night by his own lantern, he began keeping notes in his personal journal. Not the formal survey data he would submit to the railroad company, but detailed observations of Darcy's methods, how she tested air quality, how she managed water flow, how she calculated feed ratios for her growing herd by watching the animals' behavior rather than weighing portions. These notes, transferred years later into the hands of their daughter, would become the seed of a scientific record that outlasted them both. When Ronan left to file his report, a report that would declare the mountain devoid of any commercially viable mineral deposits, he stood at the entrance of the mine with his pack on his back and his maps rolled under his arm. There is more to build here, he said. It was not a question. Darcy nodded once, and he turned and walked down the slope, and she watched him go and felt something she had not felt since the morning Jocelyn slipped the knife into her pocket, the specific fragile weight of being connected to someone who might come back. He had been gone 3 months when the earth shifted. Darcy was carrying hay from the storage tunnel to the main chamber, a routine trip she had made hundreds of times when a low vibration ran through the floor beneath her feet. She stopped. The vibration became a groan deep and geological, and then a roar as a section of the tunnel ceiling between her and the main chamber gave way. Rock and dust and shattered timber crashed down in a wall of debris that filled the tunnel from floor to ceiling, and the shock wave of displaced air blew out her candle and threw her backward onto the hay bales. Darkness, complete and total. Dust so thick she could taste it mineral and sharp. And beneath the ringing in her ears, the sound of stone bleeding frantically on the other side of the collapse, separated from her by a ton of broken rock. Darcy did not panic. She lay still, coughing dust, cataloging her body. No broken bones, no blood she could feel. She got to her hands and knees and began to assess. She was in the hay storage section cut off from the main chamber. The pipe system still ran through this section, so she had water. She had hay, which was not food but could sustain her minimally. The air was still moving through a crack above her, thin but present. She would not suffocate. She would not freeze. She would not die quickly. But she could not move the rock fall alone. The stones were too large, the timber too heavy. She was trapped. The first day she tried anyway. She pulled at stones until her fingers bled and her arms trembled, and the pile had not shifted. The second day she rationed water, ate a handful of hay seeds, and listened. Stone's bleeding had stopped. Either the lamb had calmed or he had moved deeper into the main chamber away from the noise. She chose to believe the former. On the second night, lying in perfect darkness on a bed of hay, Darcy spoke to her grandmother for the first time since the old woman's death. "Linnea, you told me everything has a hidden warmth. What is the hidden warmth of a wall of stone that won't move?" No answer came. Only the drip of water and the faint whisper of air through the crack above. On the morning of the third day, she heard digging, not from the direction of the main chamber, but from above, scraping rhythmic and determined, growing closer. Then daylight blinding, and sudden a hole opening in the earth above her and a hand reaching down. A large hand, weathered and scarred with dirt packed under the nails. Niles Prescott pulled her out of the ground the way a man pulls a root from the earth, with both hands, without ceremony, without a single unnecessary word. He set her on her feet in the open air and stepped back, and Darcy stood blinking in the winter sunlight, her lungs filling with cold, clean air, her eyes streaming from the brightness. She looked at Niles clearly for the first time. He was older than she had guessed, his face deeply lined, his hair more gray than brown, and on his neck, visible now in the full light, a long scar ran from below his ear to his collarbone, old and white, the kind of scar left by a rope pulled tight. "How did you know?" she asked. "Watch the steam from the vent shaft," he said. "Been watching it every morning for 2 years. When it went thin, I knew something was wrong inside." He had been watching. All this time, since the day he walked away from her mind and never came back, he had been watching the column of warm vapor that rose from the mountain's ventilation shaft, reading it the way a sailor reads smoke from a distant shore. When the column changed, he came. Darcy asked the question that had been living in her since the day she first touched the carved letters on the chamber wall. "Do you know who DL was? The person who lived here before me?" Niles was quiet for a long time. He looked out over the valley where the smoke from farmhouse chimneys drew thin lines against the gray sky. "My grandmother," he said finally. "Della Larkin, after the war. Her husband's family cast her out because she married a Cherokee man. She lived in this mine 3 years before she went back down, changed her name, started over." He paused. "I grew up on the story. When you showed up, I wanted to run you off. Protect the place. Keep it like she left it. But then I went inside and saw what you built, and I knew she would have wanted it used. She would have wanted someone to finish what she started." Darcy looked at the scar on his neck and did not ask about it. Some stories declare themselves in the telling. Others are written on the body and read only by those who have earned the right. She and Niles worked together for 2 days to clear the collapsed tunnel and shore up the damaged section with fresh timber. He showed her how to read stress cracks in the ceiling rock, where to place supports, how to listen for the subtle creaking that preceded a shift. Then he left as silently as he had come, and the mine entrance felt different when he was gone. Not emptier, but more known. She was no longer the only person alive who understood what this place was. Ronan returned 2 weeks later, true to his word, carrying tools and supplies he had purchased with the last of his surveying pay. He found Darcy with bruises on her arms and fresh timber in the tunnels, and a look on her face that told him something fundamental had changed in his absence. She told him about the collapse, about Niles, about Della Larkin. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "Then we build it stronger." They worked through the remaining weeks of autumn, reinforcing tunnels, expanding the stable, preparing for winter. Their partnership deepened into something that had no need for declaration. They moved through the mine in a shared rhythm, anticipating each other's needs, communicating in gestures and glances. One evening, sitting by the thermal pool after a long day of hauling timber, Ronan spoke about Philadelphia for the first time, about the woman he had been engaged to marry, whose family had wanted to use his surveying maps to stake fraudulent land claims. About the day he discovered the scheme and refused, in the systematic destruction of his professional reputation that followed. About the train west, the contract with the railroad, the deliberate choice to disappear into the most remote corner of the map he could find. "I drew maps for people who wanted to steal," he said. "Here I draw maps for someone who wants to build. These are the first honest lines I've put on paper in years." Darcy did not respond with words. She placed her hand over his the first time she had touched him deliberately, and the gesture contained everything that needed to be said. Then the winter came, and it was not an ordinary winter. The old-timers in the valley would call it the winter of the fallen stars, a season so cold that the air itself seemed to crystallize and shatter. It did not arrive with snow. It arrived with a silence so complete it felt predatory, an absence of sound that meant every bird had fled, and every creek had frozen, and every living thing with the sense to do so had gone to ground. The temperature dropped to levels no one in the valley had seen in living memory. Birds fell from the sky, dead in flight. The river froze to its bed, a ribbon of gray ice that would not thaw until April. In the barns of the valley, catastrophe unfolded with methodical cruelty. Hay froze into solid blocks the animals could not eat. Water barrels burst the expanding ice, splitting the oak staves with sounds like gunfire. The chickens died first quietly on their roosts. Then the sheep, pressing together for warmth that did not exist, found frozen into a single matted mass. Then the cattle standing in the fields with the frost forming on their own breath until they lay down in the snow and did not rise. Hadley Caddell's farm was hit hardest. His pride had driven him to expand too fast, to build herds too large for his barns to shelter. He watched his life's work extinguish itself in weeks, barn by barn, field by field, until the silence of the empty stalls was the only sound left on his property. But inside the mountain, the temperature held steady. The hay was dry and fragrant. The water ran warm through the pipes. The Belgian mare stood placidly in her stall, her belly swollen with another foal. The sheep chewed their cud. The hens clucked and scratched, laying eggs with a regularity that would have seemed miraculous to any valley farmer who saw it. Darcy and Ronan moved through their candlelit world with a quiet shared purpose, feeding, cleaning, listening to the pulse of life they had cultivated while the world outside turned to ice. One night, deep in the worst of the cold, with the wind screaming across the mountaintop above them and the stone walls holding firm, Ronan sat beside Darcy near the pool and said, "In Philadelphia, I drew maps for people who wanted to steal land from strangers. Here I have drawn a map of a place where someone built a home out of nothing. This is the best work I have ever done." Darcy leaned against him. Outside, the valley was dying. Inside, life persisted steady and warm and stubborn as the river stone in her pocket. The contrast was absolute, and it needed no language to explain itself. The valley had tried to conquer winter with wooden walls and brute endurance. Darcy had simply stepped out of its path and let the mountain do what the mountain had always done. When the thaw finally came, it revealed a valley stripped of its future. The fields were graveyards of livestock. The surviving farmers, gaunt and broken, stared at a landscape of total loss. And somewhere in the back of someone's memory, a thought stirred the ghost girl on the mountain. The one who had been selling wool and eggs and cheese all through the winter, appearing at Cora Jessup's store with goods that should not have existed, then vanishing back up the trail before anyone thought to ask how. The thaw came slowly, as though spring itself was afraid of what it would reveal. The snow did not melt so much as withdraw, pulling back from the valley floor, like a tide retreating from a battlefield, and what it left behind was a landscape of ruin. The bones of cattle lay scattered across the fields, half buried in mud, white against the brown earth. Fence posts tilted at broken angles. Barns stood with their doors hanging open, and inside them there was nothing but silence and the faint, sweet smell of hay that had frozen into useless blocks and was now thawing into mold. The valley looked as though it had been emptied by a war that made no sound. The surviving farmers of Harlan Creek gathered in the church on the first Sunday after the roads became passable. They sat in the pews with their coats still on because the church's wood stove could not heat the room fast enough, and they looked at each other with the hollow expressions of people who had been robbed of everything except the knowledge of what they had lost. No livestock, no breeding pairs, no seed money for restocking. The economy of the valley, built over 3 generations on cattle and wool, had been erased in 9 weeks. Beckett Polk sat in the second row. He was a large man with a red face and hands that had been strong before the winter and were now merely big, purposeless things resting on his knees. He had been Hadley Caddell's closest friend for 20 years, the man who had nodded in silent agreement when Hadley cast his daughter out, who had clapped Hadley on the shoulder afterward and said, "A man's house is his own to govern." His farm had lost everything. 40 head of cattle frozen where they stood. A flock of sheep found in the barn pressed together into a single solid mass, their wool knotted with ice. Beckett had pulled them apart with a crowbar and buried them in a ditch, and the sound of the crowbar on frozen wool was a sound he would hear in his sleep for years. Reverend Emmerich Halford stood at the front of the church, and for the first time in his 30 years of ministry, he had nothing to say. He had prepared a sermon about endurance, about God's plan, about the refining fire of suffering. But looking at the faces before him, he could not bring himself to deliver it. These people did not need theology. They needed animals. They needed a way to start again, and no amount of scripture could conjure a breeding pair of sheep from the frozen ground. It was after the service, standing alone in the churchyard with the mud sucking at his boots, that Halford remembered the ghost girl of the mountain. He had seen her over the years, a figure appearing at the edge of town every few months, selling bundles of roots and jars of wild preserves at Cora Jessup's store, never speaking more than was necessary, never staying longer than the transaction required. He had heard the whispers. She lived in the old lead mine. She talked to the rock. She kept animals underground where no animal should survive. He had dismissed it all the way. The whole town had dismissed it as the song and slightly unsettling legend of a girl who had gone half wild. But desperation burns away dismissal the way fire burns away fog. Before he climbed the mountain, Halford went to see Cora Jessup. Cora was behind her counter doing inventory on what remained of her stock, which was not much. The winter had disrupted every supply line, every trade route, every thread of commerce that kept a small town breathing. Cora looked 10 years older than she had in October. "I'm going up to see the Caddell girl," Halford said. Cora did not look up from her ledger. "Don't call her that. She stopped being a Caddell the day Hadley threw her out. She's Darcy, just Darcy. I need to ask her for help." Now Cora looked up. "Then don't ask, don't beg. Don't get down on your knees and weep about God's mysterious ways. That girl is not a charity. She's a traitor. You want something from her, you bring something to trade. You offer to buy. You treat her like a person who has something you need, because she does and she knows it, and if you come at her with pity, she will shut that door in your face, and she will be right to do it." Halford nodded. He understood. He had spent his career speaking to people about the condition of their souls. But Cora Jessup, who had never shown the slightest interest in anyone's soul, understood Darcy better than he ever would. The climb took him most of a day. He was not a young man, and the trail was steep and muddy, with snowmelt, and twice he had to stop and lean against a tree and catch his breath while the valley shrank below him. But he kept going because the weight he carried was not just his own. It was the weight of every farmer sitting in that church, every empty barn, every dead animal, every child who would go hungry by summer if something did not change. He found the entrance to the mine by following the warmth. Even from 50 yards away, he could feel it, a zone of air that was softer and warmer than the mountain air around it. And when he parted the ivy and stood before the dark mouth of the tunnel, the exhalation of heated air hit his face with a force that made him take a step back. It was real. All of it was real. He called out. His voice echoed and died in the stone. Darcy appeared in the entrance with Ronan behind her. They stood together in the half-light, two figures framed by the darkness of the mountain and the pale daylight of the outside world. And Halford saw not a wild girl and a wandering surveyor, but two people standing at the threshold of the only hope his valley had left. He did not preach. He did not invoke God or duty or the bonds of community. He told the truth simply and without ornament. "Darcy, we are ruined. The winter took everything. We have no animals, no breeding stock, no way to begin again. I am not here to ask for charity. I am here to ask if you would be willing to sell us a new beginning." Darcy looked at the Reverend for a long time. Then she said, "Wait here." And she turned and went back into the mine, and Ronan followed her. Inside, in the warm chamber where the horses stood placidly, and the sheep chewed their cud, and the hens muttered on their roosts, Darcy and Ronan had the only real argument of their lives together. It was not loud. Neither of them was built for shouting. It was quiet, intense, and honest, and it lasted less than 10 minutes, and it determined the course of everything that followed. "They'll know," Ronan said. "They'll all know. They'll come here. They'll tramp through these tunnels and poke at the walls and ask questions and bring their noise and their opinions and their judgment. This place, what we have here, it will never be just ours again." Darcy heard him. She heard the fear beneath the logic, and she knew it was not selfishness. Ronan had come to this mountain because the world outside had betrayed him. The family of his former fiancée in Philadelphia had tried to use his surveying skills to seize public land, and when he refused, they had destroyed his reputation and his livelihood. He had fled to the Ozarks the way a wounded animal flees to high ground, to hide, to heal, to be left alone. This mine, this warm, impossible place was the first home he had trusted since the world taught him not to trust. And now Darcy was proposing to open the door. "I know," she said. "I know what we lose." "Then why?" Darcy was quiet for a moment. She reached into her pocket and took out the river stone and held it in her palm, turning it slowly, feeling its weight. "When I carried Stone in from the snow," she said, "I could have kept him for myself. One lamb, one girl, one warm cave. That would have been enough to survive. But if I had done that, if I had closed the door and kept the warmth for myself and let everything outside freeze, I would have become my father. I would have become the person who holds the latch and pushes someone else into the cold." Ronan stared at her. The words landed in a place deeper than argument, deeper than logic, in the part of him that knew she was not just talking about Darcy in the valley. She was talking about him, about Philadelphia, about the year he had spent running from betrayal instead of building something beyond its reach. He had chosen the mountain because it was safe. Darcy had chosen the mountain because it was the only option left. But staying in the mountain forever, hiding from the world behind walls of stone, that was a different kind of coffin. He nodded, not because she had won the argument, because she had shown him what he looked like from the outside, and what he saw was a man still running. Darcy went back to the entrance where Reverend Halford stood, waiting, his hat in his hands, his face raw from the wind. "We have lambs," she said. Her voice was clear and firm. "The mare is due again soon. There will be chicks before the month is out. The price is fair market. No discounts, no debts, no charity. Cash or trade." Halford closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. The resurrection of Harlan Creek did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without resistance. The surviving farmers pooled their remaining resources, borrowed what they could, and began making the trek up the mountain to buy breeding stock from the Stonewarm farm. The animals they brought back down were healthy, robust, their coats thick, their eyes bright, carrying in their blood the subtle resilience of an upbringing no other livestock in the Ozarks had ever known. But not everyone in the valley was grateful, and not everyone was willing to accept that their survival depended on the girl they had watched walk away 3 years ago, without lifting a finger to stop it. Beckett Polk bought his sheep from Darcy on a Tuesday morning in late April. He paid in cash, counting out the coins with deliberate slowness, placing each one on the rock beside the mine entrance, as though the act of paying caused him physical discomfort. He did not look Darcy in the eye. He did not say thank you. He took the lead ropes and walked away without a word. And that evening in the back room of the general store, he began his campaign. "It is not natural," he said to the 3 farmers drinking with him. "A girl living in a hole in the ground, keeping the animals in the dark. You ever seen sheep with coats that thick? You ever seen lambs born in January that didn't freeze? Something is wrong with that place. Something ungodly." The word spread the way rumors spread in small communities, not through proclamation, but through repetition, growing louder and more distorted with each telling. By the end of the week, half the town had heard some version of Beckett's accusation. By the end of the second week, he had convinced 3 other farmers to sign a petition to the county government requesting an investigation into dangerous and irregular activities in an abandoned mine, citing public safety as a justification, but carrying behind it the unspoken engine of his real motivation, the inability to bear the debt of gratitude to a girl he had helped to exile. The petition never reached the county seat. It was stopped by 3 people acting independently for 3 different reasons. Reverend Halford addressed his congregation the following Sunday. He did not mention Darcy by name. He did not mention Beckett. He told the story of Joseph sold into slavery by his own brothers, who rose to power in a foreign land, and when famine came, fed the very people who had betrayed him. He told the story simply, without embellishment, and when he was finished, he looked out at his congregation and let the silence do the work. Every person in that church understood who Joseph was. Most of them had the grace to look down at their hands. The next evening at a town meeting, called to discuss the petition, Cora Jessup stood up. She was not a woman given to public speaking. She was a woman given to commerce, to numbers, to the hard arithmetic of profit and loss. She spoke for less than a minute. "I was the first person to turn that girl away," she said. "When she came to my store 3 years ago, I told her she carried her father's debts, and I sent her back into the cold. I did that, and now I am standing here in a store that is still open because of the wool I buy from her sheep, and the roots and preserves she sells me that I sell to you. If you shut down that mine, I go bankrupt. And when I go bankrupt, you lose the only store in 40 miles. So if any of you want to sign that petition, go ahead. But sign it knowing you're signing the death warrant of this town, because that girl on the mountain is the only reason any of us are still here." She sat down. The room was silent for a long time. The third intervention came from the mountain itself. The morning after the town meeting, Beckett Polk opened his front door and found a deer carcass hanging from the porch beam. A big doe, cleanly dressed, the belly slit, and emptied with the skill of a man who had been butchering game for 40 years. There was no note, no message, no footprint in the mud that Beckett could identify. But the message was clear to anyone who understood the language of the mountain. "I know where you live. I know what you said. I have been generous. Do not make me be something else." Beckett withdrew the petition that afternoon. He told the other farmers he had reconsidered on the grounds of community harmony. He did not mention the deer. He did not mention the cold sweat that had broken across his back when he stepped onto his porch and saw it hanging there, the dead eyes catching the early light. Darcy never learned what Niles Prescott did for her that night. The secret sat between Niles and the darkness, the way all of Niles's truths did, unspoken, unadorned, known only to the mountain and the man who walked it. It was his answer to the cheese and the herbs she had left on his rock years ago, his payment for the medicine that had eased the ache in his joints through 3 long winters. He did not think of it as kindness. He thought of it as balance. The mountain kept its accounts, and so did he. Summer came, and with it, Hadley Caddell. Darcy was in the main chamber spreading fresh bedding in the horse stall when Ronan appeared in the tunnel entrance. His face was tight. His hands were still. "Someone is at the door," he said. "Your father." Darcy stood motionless for 10 seconds. She counted them. She counted them the way she counted everything in the mind, deliberately, precisely giving each unit its full weight. Then she set down the bedding, wiped her hands on her trousers, and walked through the tunnel toward the light. Hadley Caddell stood before the entrance to the mine. He was 61 years old, but he looked 80. The winter had consumed him from the inside the way fire consumes a log. The shape remained, but the substance was ash. His farm was sold. His debts were paid with the proceeds, and what remained was a man with empty pockets and a name that now meant less in the valley than the name of the girl he had thrown away. He had come to buy 2 sheep. He held the money in his hand, coins he had earned, doing day labor on someone else's land, and he stood with his shoulders curved inward, as though his own skeleton was trying to make him smaller. He did not look Darcy in the eye. He looked at her boots. They were leather, hand-stitched, solid and well-made. Not the thin shoes she had been wearing the morning he closed the door. She had made those boots herself from the hide of a deer Niles had left at the entrance, tanned with oak bark and sewn with sinew, and they were the boots of a woman who had built a world with her hands, while the world that discarded her fell apart. Darcy could have refused him. Every cell in her 19-year-old body wanted to say the words, "You told me I was not your child, so you are not my customer." She could feel the sentence forming in her throat, each word sharp and satisfying, the way a stone is satisfying when it fits perfectly in the hand. Justice. Simple, clean, and final. She did not say it. She went inside. She selected 2 sheep, not the weakest, not the ones she could most easily spare. The 2 best ewes in her flock, heavy with wool, bright-eyed, healthy, carrying in their bodies the proof of what the mountain's warmth could build. She led them out and placed the ropes in Hadley's hands. She told him the price. The same price she charged everyone. Not lower, because that would be pity, and pity from a daughter to a father who had cast her out would be a cruelty more refined than anything he had done to her. Not higher, because that would be revenge. And revenge was a door that once opened could never be closed again. Hadley counted out the coins. His hands trembled. He placed them one by one on the flat rock beside the entrance, and each coin made a small sound against the stone, and each small sound was a word in a language he did not know how to speak. He took the ropes. He stood holding them. He opened his mouth, and Darcy saw his jaw tighten, the muscles along the hinge clenching and releasing, clenching and releasing, the way they had on the morning he expelled her, when his hand had paused on the latch for 2 seconds before pushing it home. He was trying to speak. The words were in him, somewhere behind the wall of pride and shame and years of silence, but they could not find the opening. His mouth closed. Then he did something Darcy did not expect. He released the ropes. The 2 sheep stood patiently, nosing at the ground. Hadley reached into the pocket of his coat and took out an object and knelt slowly, his knees cracking, and placed it on the ground at Darcy's feet. Then he stood, picked up the ropes again, and walked down the slope. He did not turn around. Darcy looked down. On the ground, sitting on the mud and gravel, was a piece of iron, small, heavy, dark with age. She recognized it instantly. The latch. The iron latch from the front door of the Caddell farmhouse. The latch that had clicked shut behind her on the last morning of October 3 years ago. The latch whose sound she heard in her sleep, in her quiet moments, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He had removed it from the door and carried it up the mountain and placed it at her feet. It was not an apology. Hadley Caddell did not have the language for apology. He had never been taught the words, and the years had calcified the silence until speech was no longer possible. But he had hands, and his hands had removed the thing that had divided them, and he had carried it to her, and he had knelt to place it on the ground, and the kneeling was the closest he would ever come to asking for what he could not name. Darcy picked up the latch. It was heavier than she remembered, or she was more aware of weight now, more attuned to what things cost and what they carried. She stood at the entrance of the mine, holding the iron latch in one hand and the river stone of Grandma Linnea in the other. 2 objects from 2 worlds. The world that had expelled her and the world that had kept her. The inheritance of cruelty and the inheritance of love, both fitting in her palms, both part of the same story. She carried the latch inside and placed it on the stone ledge beside the steaming pool, directly beneath the carved words of Della Larkin. The latch and the inscription faced each other across 56 years of silence, 2 testimonies to the mountain's long habit of receiving what the world discarded. Ronan stood in the tunnel behind her. He did not touch her. He did not speak. There are moments in a life that belong only to the person living them, and Ronan had learned to recognize those moments, and his gift to Darcy was the discipline of standing close without intruding. They were married that summer at the mouth of the mine, with Reverend Halford reading the vows and the mountain standing as witness. The guests were few, a handful of farmers who had bought their futures from Darcy's flock, standing in the sunlight with their hats in their hands. Cora Jessup came carrying a gift wrapped in brown paper. It was a new accounting ledger, leather-bound with Darcy's name stamped on the cover in gold letters. "You can raise sheep better than anyone I know," Cora said, "but your bookkeeping would make a grown man weep. Learn to keep proper records." Darcy laughed. It was the first time anyone outside the mine had heard her laugh, and the sound of it, unexpected and unguarded, moved through the small gathering the way sunlight moves through a room when a curtain is drawn open. Niles Prescott did not attend. The next morning, Darcy found a buckskin laid across the threshold of the mine entrance, tanned to perfection, soft as cloth. No note, no footprint. She folded it and placed it in the chamber where her children would sleep, and it stayed there for 40 years, growing softer with use, carrying the scent of the mountain in its fibers long after the man who made it was gone. The years turned. Darcy and Ronan had 2 children. Corwin, their son, inherited Darcy's silent understanding of animals and earth. He could calm a frightened horse with a touch, could tell by the way a ewe walked, whether she was carrying 1 lamb or 2, could read the temperature of the mine's air currents with his skin the way his mother read them. Sabine, their daughter, inherited Ronan's love of systems and records. She began keeping the farm's journals when she was 12 years old, writing in a careful hand that grew more precise with each passing year, documenting everything: feed ratios, water temperatures, animal health, breeding records, weather patterns, market prices. Her journals would become, decades later, a scientific document of extraordinary value. But in the beginning, they were simply a girl's attempt to capture in ink what her mother carried in her bones. Jocelyn Caddell came back into Darcy's life 15 years after the exile in a letter forwarded through Cora's store. Jocelyn had left Hadley's household years before, after the farm was sold, and had been living in a neighboring town working as a seamstress. Her letter was short. "Did you keep the knife? I hope it helped some. I am sorry I did not do more." Darcy wrote back. It was the first letter she had ever sent to anyone in her family. "The knife saved my life twice. Once to cut a snare that fed me through my first winter. Once to stand at my door and defend my home. You do not need to apologize. You acted when no one else acted, and that is enough." Jocelyn visited the following summer. She walked into the mine and stood in the main chamber and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming evidence that a small act performed in terror and secrecy, a knife and 4 coins slipped into a pocket, while a cruel man's back was turned, had cascaded through years and circumstances, and become this, a warm, breathing, living world inside a mountain, filled with animals and children, and the sound of a family that should never have existed. Corwin called her Aunt Jocelyn, and she became a regular presence, the woman who sat by the pool and told Darcy's children about Grandma Linnea. She told them about the hidden warmth, about the patience required to find it, about the old woman with hands like roots who had once gotten lost on a mountain and found a place where the rock exhaled. The children listened the way children always listen to stories about grandmothers they never met, with wide eyes and open hearts, not knowing yet that the stories were also blueprints. Dr. Dorian Osgood arrived in the mine one autumn when Darcy was in her 40s. He was a geologist from a university in the East, a man with wire spectacles and an enthusiasm that vibrated through his entire body. He had heard the stories, followed the rumors, and come to see for himself. He stayed a month. He lowered thermometers into deep crevices, took water samples, filled notebooks with frenetic calculations. He was a validator, a man from the world of institutions who had come to put formal names on what Darcy had built from instinct and necessity. "It is a marvel of geothermal husbandry," he declared one evening, his face flushed with discovery. "A perfectly balanced, self-sustaining ecosystem, harnessing the heat of the planet itself." Darcy listened to his grand Latin words. She looked into the main chamber where Corwin was settling the horses for the night, their soft breath echoing in the warm air. She smiled a small, private smile. "I just called it keeping warm," she said. Osgood published his paper. The scientific world learned of the farm woman of the Ozarks who had pioneered a new form of agriculture without knowing she had done it. They gave it names: sustainable agriculture, closed-loop systems, biointegration. But Darcy's validation did not live in the paper. It lived in the sound of her children's laughter echoing down corridors of stone, in the healthy sheen of a horse's coat, in the steady exhalation of the mountain that had taken her in when the world of men had pushed her out. Darcy grew old. Her hair turned white, fine as frost on winter grass. Her hands knotted with arthritis, but never stopped working. The Stone Warm Farm, as it came to be known, was a multi-generational enterprise now. Corwin managed the livestock with the same quiet instinct his mother had possessed. Sabine managed the books, in the growing trade with the outside world, her meticulous journals becoming an invaluable record of a unique way of life. Grandchildren played in the tunnels where Darcy had once huddled alone, their voices filling spaces that had known only silence in the drip of water for 100 years. When her strength began to fade, Darcy spent more and more time in the deep chamber near the pool. The warmth eased her joints. The familiar sounds, cattle lowing water, falling hay rustling, were the final movement of a symphony that had been playing for decades. Ronan, his hair white too, and his cartographer's hands spotted with age, sat beside her for hours without speaking. Their shared silence was a conversation that had lasted a lifetime and needed no conclusion, only continuation. One afternoon, Darcy asked Corwin to bring her the iron latch from its ledge. He brought it to her, this piece of metal that had sat beside Della Larkin's inscription for more than 40 years, darkening with mineral deposits becoming part of the cave, the way everything in the cave eventually became part of the stone. She held it in her hands. It was heavier than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply lighter now, the body surrendering its substance, the way a candle surrenders its wax slowly and with warmth. She called Sabine to her side. "When I am gone," she said, "hang this on the inside of the entrance, where everyone who comes in can see it." Sabine looked at the latch. "What is it?" "It's the latch from your grandfather's door, the door he closed when he sent me away. He brought it to me the year you were born. He pulled it off the door and carried it up the mountain and put it on the ground at my feet. That was how he knew to say he was sorry." Sabine took the latch gently. "Why hang it at the entrance?" Darcy looked toward the distant glow of daylight where the tunnel curved toward the outside world. "So that everyone who walks in here knows this door does not lock. So that no one who enters this mountain ever wonders whether they will be allowed to leave. Your grandfather closed a door and it cost me everything. I want this door to stay open forever, and I want that latch to be the proof." The seasons turned. The light at the entrance shifted from gold to gray and back again. Darcy watched it from deeper and deeper inside the mountain, the outside world becoming a distant, bright frame at the end of a long, warm corridor. On her last day, she sat in her chair near the pool, wrapped in a blanket, woven from the wool of sheep that were the great-great-grandchildren of Stone, the first lamb she had carried in from the snow. Ronan sat beside her, his hand over hers, the two of them as still and as permanent as the rock around them. "It still breathes," she whispered. Her head rested against Ronan's shoulder. Her eyes were closed. He knew she was not talking about herself. She was talking about the mountain, the constant exhalation of warm air that had sustained her world for 6 decades. The pulse she had felt the first time she stepped through the ivy curtain as a freezing, starving, terrified girl of 16, and felt the impossible warmth wrap around her. It was still there. It would always be there. The mountain did not forget. The mountain did not stop. It was her last observation, the last thing she noticed about the world she had studied with such patience and such love. And it was enough. Darcy died in the spring on a morning when the first new lambs of the season were taking their wobbling, uncertain steps across the warm floor of the pen she had built with her own hands 40 years before. Ronan was beside her. The river stone was in her palm where it had been in pocket or in hand every day since the morning she walked away from her father's house. The stone was warm from her grip, and when Ronan gently removed it and held it in his own hand, he could feel her warmth in it still, and he understood that this was what Grandma Linnea had meant all along. The hidden warmth was not in the stone. It was not in the mountain. It was in the hands that held them and the heart that refused to let go. She was buried on the mountainside in a small clearing that overlooked the valley she had saved. Her grave was marked with a single uncut stone, and on top of it, Ronan placed the river pebble, smooth and small, a period at the end of a sentence that had been written across 6 decades of rock and labor and love. Ronan joined her 3 years later. His heart had lost its compass point. Sabine hung the iron latch on the inside of the mine entrance, as her mother had asked. She drove a nail into the timber frame and hung the latch from it, and it hung there with the patience of iron, saying nothing, meaning everything. It hung there when the grandchildren grew up and took over the farm. It hung there when the great-grandchildren learned to walk in the warm tunnels and thought the temperature of the deep earth was simply the way the world was supposed to feel. It hung there when new scientists came decades after Dr. Osgood with instruments more sophisticated and theories more refined, and walked through the entrance and paused at the latch and asked what it was, and Sabine Old herself by then told them. "It is a door latch," she said. "My grandfather put it on a door and closed it and sent my mother into the cold. Then he took it off the door and brought it back to her. Now it hangs here so that everyone remembers this door does not close." The scientist nodded politely the way scientists nod when they encounter folklore and went on with their measurements. They pored over Sabine's journals and marveled at the precision of the observations recorded in them. They saw feeding experiments' health data correlated with mineral content of the water temperature records from every section of the mine spanning decades. They saw a mine working generations ahead of its time. They saw science born from necessity. They gave it new names: sustainable agriculture, closed-loop systems, biointegration. But as they stood in the great central chamber, feeling the same warmth that a 16-year-old girl had felt nearly a century before they knew their names were only labels applied after the fact, they were catching up to what Darcy had always known. The knowledge had not been invented in their laboratories. It had been discovered by a girl stripped of everything, carrying nothing but a coat, a loaf of bread, and a smooth stone in her pocket. She had not sought to conquer the mountain or bend it to her will. She had listened to it, felt its warmth, and had the courage to build a world inside its breath. The latch still hangs in the entrance of the mine. The river stone still sits on the grave marker on the mountainside. And if you stand at the entrance on a winter evening, when the cold presses against the valley and the stars are sharp enough to cut, you can feel it, the slow, warm exhalation of the mountain, steady as a heartbeat, patient as stone, carrying with it the scent of hay and animals in deep earth, a breath that has been flowing since before there were people to feel it, and will continue long after the last name is forgotten and the last story is told. The mountain breathes. It has always breathed, and inside its breath, the warmth remains passed from hand to hand, from grandmother to granddaughter, from one century to the next, a gift that cannot be taken away because it was never owned. It was only found by someone patient enough to listen and brave enough to stay.